Chapter 4. Monte's Contemplation. When Monte walked into what the family called the Great Room, he lowered himself into the cushioned chair with a slow, deliberate exhale. The worn fabric gave beneath him like an old friend, familiar, forgiving, and patient with the weight he carried. The lamplight glowed warm and golden, casting soft shadows across the walls. It was the kind of light that usually brought comfort. Tonight, it felt distant, like it belonged to someone else's piece. Monte's gaze drifted across the room. The bookshelves lined with biographies and brittle newspaper clippings, the framed photo of Tony at 4 with 2 missing teeth, the museum ticket stub pinned to the corkboard. He saw each object, but not really. His eyes passed over them the way a hand skims water, touching, but never breaking the surface. For years, Monte had tried to build a bridge between the past and the present. He wanted Tony to feel the pulse of history, not as something buried in textbooks, but as something alive, something urgent, something that still breathed. He had spoken the names of Medgar Evers, Malcolm X, and Dr. King, not as distant legends, but as men. Men who had bled, marched, wept, and died less than 20 years before Tony was born. Men whose shadows still stretched across their front porch because they had stood for the people's rights, just as Mrs. Parks had. But for Tony, those names had always hovered just out of reach, like distant thunder, heard but not felt, until now. Monte pressed his palms together, letting out a slow breath. The silence in the room wasn't empty. It was full. Years of effort, hope, and the quiet ache of wanting your child to understand something you can't force them to feel. He had always believed, had needed to believe, that understanding could be passed down like a family recipe. That if he spoke loud enough and often enough, the weight of their heritage would eventually take root. That Tony would feel it the way he did. Not just as knowledge, but as blood memory. But that wasn't how it worked. Tony had grown. Not in the way Monte had planned, but in the way that mattered. He had taken those names into himself, not as facts, but as echoes. Echoes that finally found a place to land. Monte rubbed his thumb against his fingertips, as if searching for something invisible. He wasn't resentful. He wasn't disappointed. But the truth pressed against him in a quiet, bittersweet way. The kind of ache that settles in places words can't reach. He and Tony's mother had stitched history into their son's life like careful embroidery. Bedtime stories, museum trips, long drives through ancestral towns. They had hoped the thread would become part of him. But understanding doesn't pass down like heirlooms. It must be found, lived, and chosen. Monte had poured so much of himself into helping Tony find his voice, shaping syllables, coaxing out sounds, that somewhere along the way, Tony had come to see him only as the man who helped him speak. Not the man meant to guide him through history, but the one meant to light the path and wait. And waiting wasn't easy. When Tony stepped outside to get the mail, Monte stayed in the great room, and something inside him shifted. A clarity he hadn't expected settled over him. Tony didn't need more museums, more books, or more carefully worded lessons at the dinner table. He needed someone else. Someone who carried history not in footnotes, but in flesh and bone. Someone whose voice bore the weight of lived experience, scarred, weathered, and real. A man like Mr. Maxwell, whose presence alone spoke volumes no textbook ever could. That realization unsettled Monte. And yet, it inspired him too. Tony had found what he was missing, and that should have been enough. Had all those years of stories and lessons been nothing more than background noise? Had Tony only started listening when the words came from someone who had bled for them? Monte closed his eyes for a moment, letting the questions settle. He had always believed history was a bridge, not a wall. He wanted Tony to cross it, to feel the echoes of struggle and triumph beneath his feet. And Tony had crossed it. Just not in Monte's footsteps. But wasn't that the point? Monte's mind drifted back to the first time he had taken Tony to the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma, Alabama. Tony had been 10, too young to fully understand, but old enough to sense the weight of the place. The sun was blazing and unrelenting. Heat shimmered off the asphalt, and the metal railings burned beneath their fingertips. Tourists snapped photos. Cars hummed behind them. But for a moment, time folded in on itself. Monte had rested a hand on Tony's shoulder, staring out across the bridge like he was seeing something beyond the horizon.
They came across this bridge knowing they might not make it to the other side, but they walked anyway.
Tony had looked down at his feet, imagining footsteps layered beneath his own. Boots, sneakers, bare soles, marching forward through fear. Monte knelt beside him.
History isn't always about what you read, Tony. Sometimes it's about what you walk through and what you carry with you afterwards.
Tony hadn't understood then, but he understood now. Listening to Mr. Maxwell, Tony had finally felt what Monte had been trying to give him all along. History wasn't behind them, it was beneath them. And it was asking them to keep walking. Monte exhaled, slow, quiet, releasing something he had held too tightly for too long. The evening light spilled through the windows, stretching across the floor in long, gentle lines. The house was still, wrapped in the hush that follows something important. Monte sat in his chair, hands resting on his knees, fingers gently curled. He wasn't reading. He wasn't thinking about chores. He was simply breathing. Tony stepped back into the room, his footsteps light and uncertain. He paused in the doorway, scanning the space as if seeing it differently now. Then he walked in. Monte looked up. Their eyes met, and in that stillness, something shifted again. Something quiet. Something real. Tony sat on the edge of the couch, elbows on his knees, hands clasped. He didn't speak. Neither did Monte. They didn't need to. There were no lessons to give, no questions to ask, and no stories to explain. Just presence. Monte studied his son. Not the boy who once struggled to form words, not the child he had tried so hard to guide, but the young man sitting across from him now, changed, awake, and carrying something invisible but unmistakable. Tony looked back, and for the first time, Monte saw it in his eyes. Understanding, not the kind you teach, but the kind you earn. Monte's chest rose with a slow breath. He nodded once, small but full of meaning. Tony nodded back, and that was it. No speeches, no tears. Just a quiet knowing that passed between them like a thread finally pulled through. A connection forged not by instruction, but by recognition. They sat there for a while, the silence warm and whole. And in that silence, Monte smiled. Not because he had been right, or because Tony had finally listened, but because they had met each other here, in this moment, as men. As keepers of the same story, a story that would continue, together.